Jones, Senior Manager of Partnerships at Grantmakers for Education, and I'd like to welcome you to our GFE Conference Week, which is part of our conference year-round that began in August and will run through April 2021. We're excited that you're with us, and this is our annual signature event where we come together to address current and future topics in education. We can't do this event without the generous support of our sponsors, and we're grateful for their partnership and engagement with us in this unique year. I'd also like to acknowledge our wonderful planning committee that really helped us to inform our topics and format in this virtual learning environment. Today, we're going to continue to build off of our powerful first day of Conference Week yesterday, where we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day together, as well as explored the future of student voice and democracy. Our focus today is the future of pre-K through 12 education. The triple crisis of COVID-19, a declining economy, and our urgency to tackle racial justice all run directly through our pre-K through 12 education system. As we all know, calls for systemic change have never been louder. In today's plenary, Kaya Henderson and DeRay Mckesson will bring their perspective as educators and activists on fundamental questions such as what is the purpose of school, what essential capacities will learners need to bolster our democracy, what should schools teach, especially regarding our country's racial history, and who will be leading our schools in classrooms. Following their conversation, we will hear from a distinguished panel representing the philanthropic community, reflecting on the challenge of meeting the varied needs of our pre-K through 12 system in this moment in which threats to equity are growing. At this time, it is my pleasure to begin this conversation by introducing Kaya and DeRay. First, Kaya Henderson is founder and CEO of Reconstruction US. She also leads the Global Learning Lab for Community Impact at Teach for All. There, she seeks to grow the impact of locally rooted, globally informed leaders all over the world who are catalyzing community and system-level change to provide children with the education, support, and opportunity to shape a better future. She is perhaps best known for serving as chancellor of DC Public Schools from 2010 through 2016. Kaya will be joined by DeRay Mckesson. DeRay is a civil rights activist focused primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. He has advocated for issues related to children, youth, and families since he was a teen. As a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and a co-founder for Campaign Zero, DeRay has worked to connect individuals with knowledge and tools and provide citizens and policymakers with common sense policies that ensure equity. He has been praised by President Obama for his work as a community organizer and has advised officials at all levels of government as well as internationally, and continues to provide capacity to activists, organizers, and influencers who make an impact. I would now like to turn our plenary session over to Kaya and DeRay. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Super excited. It's good to always good to be in conversation with you, Kaya. I'm interested in this moment where it's protest, it's a conversation about race and justice. Most of us are stuck at home, so people are sort of talking about and grappling with these things in ways that they might not have had time to do before. I'm interested, Kaya, in how we make sense of this. And I'll just say that one of my worries is that, we've been here before in the sense that like a lot of conversation, a lot of attention, and then you look back and you're like, what changed, right? We're trying to figure out, is this moment going to be different or is it going to be some of the same? I will also say, and I know you and I have talked about this offline a little bit, is that I am really worried that the whole space is not being honest about the long-term implications of this moment, about like the funding cliffs that will come, about how long are districts going to keep bus drivers and custodians and hall monitors on the rolls when there is no physical school. And I just love to know like how you're thinking about this moment.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, I think on the one hand, it feels similar to previous times where we've gotten all hyped up about things and then not a lot has happened. But I think what makes me feel like this is different is the intersectionality of, or the way we are talking about education intersecting with healthcare and with government services and with housing and with justice. When I left DC Public Schools, one of the things that I committed to myself was that I would never work on just education alone, because effectively it's like whack-a-mole. Even if you kill it on education, for the kids who need it most, issues of housing, issues of healthcare, issues of jobs all creep up to kill the very thing that you were able to bloom in the education space. And so if we're not dealing with these things in an intersectional way where we see the interdependencies, then I think we don't stand a fighting chance. And this feels different in that moment. It feels like we are talking about justice and education. We are talking about healthcare and education in ways that we never did before. In fact, we were just in recent conversation about Rhode Island and how reopening schools in Rhode Island looked very different than most places because the governor centralized the reopening of schools, right? Put private schools and public schools on the same calendar, deployed the health department, the National Guard, and all of government services to figure out how to jointly reopen schools. I think the way we solve big complex and complicated problems is when we bring a bunch of different people to bear on the solution. And I think that's what we saw in Rhode Island. I think that's what we have the opportunity to do, to not just think about education in a silo anymore, but to think about how it works alongside these other systems.
Do you still believe in, and I know I'm not like just interviewing you, but I do have all these questions. I'm like, God, what do you think? Do you still believe in mayoral control like you did before?
I believe in mayoral control like I have never have before, right? Because, and in fact, right, I actually feel like what there are, so how do I'll talk about DC. There is a growing call in DC for people to, for mayoral control to be overthrown. If you don't like what's going on, you don't overthrow mayoral control. You can elect a different mayor if you'd like. But what I would tell you is that the coordination of these services and the integration of these services, we weren't able to make the progress that we made in DC public schools without deep coordination with the Department of Health, deep coordination with the Department of Planning, deep coordination. School boards can't do that. They can't bring all of these services to bear. And you might not like the government, and you might want the government out of your business, but in fact, the government touches so many pieces of our regular lives as John Q. citizen, that if those efforts are not coordinated, then you don't win. So I actually think mayoral control is even more important because somebody needs to be, in the same way that we watched Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island coordinate the reopening of schools. We were able to, for 40 years, I mean, people don't remember in DC what it was like when we had a school board where for 40 years our buildings were neglected. But once we came under mayoral control, we were able to mobilize the resources, the expertise, and the energy, frankly, to rebuild the vast majority of our schools. That takes focused coordination, it takes strategy, it takes planning, and I actually feel like we need a centralized apparatus to be able to do that. Here's my question for you, since we are talking to each other. You mentioned the cliff that is coming, and you and I have been talking about this, right? I keep saying to my friends, winter is coming, a la Game of Thrones, where I actually think that things are going to be terrible. Say a little bit more about what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, Kai, we both came into this work in the human capital space, leading in human capital, you in DC, I was a chief human capital in Baltimore. And I'll never forget having to deal with the cliffs. Like right before I left, we thought we were going to have $100 million deficit. We had plans to lay off 1,000 people. We had legitimately mocked it up. It wasn't something Dr. Santelises sort of just said out loud. It was we were really planning for it. And in the end, we got some money. We laid off about, a little bit less than 100 people, which is a lot better than 1,000 people, but that was really rough. And I couldn't imagine now having to think about how am I keeping the bus drivers and the cafeteria workers and the hall monitors and all the, like a whole set of people who are not functionally working right now on the rolls. Like how long would I have money to do that? So I think that's one. The second though, and we dealt with this with Race to the Top, is, is that all these school systems, they they bought FTE with that money. They bought like whole positions that were like mission critical, race to top end it, and all of a sudden you're like decimating whole departments. You know, curriculum goes from 20 people to 5. You know, math goes from 4 people to 1. You know, it just, we lived through that, and it was really, really wild to watch. And I have some friends who are still in school systems who they are experiencing a grant funding crisis right now because the grant money dried up, and it's in this awkward moment where they can't just hold it over because there is no money. So I think the cliff is coming. I think that school system people are praying. I think there's a lot of prayer that like something's going to give, like the federal government's going to pump money in. But I think the districts need to start planning for a worst case scenario. So when it comes, people aren't surprised, because having, and you lived through layoffs too, having lived through it, the worst part of it is when you have to make the decision too quick to plan right. That's just bad for everybody. It's bad for kids. It's bad for families. So I'm actually nervous about that. And what a lot of people I feel like don't realize is that school systems often employ as many people as a city. I don't know how it was in DCPS, but it was true in Baltimore. In Baltimore, we employed as many people as the city of Baltimore. Our budget was as big as the city's budget. So like people often think about the school system as this like ancillary thing, but it's like a huge economic driver, and we were sensitive to that. So it's interesting to be in a conversation about grant money because, you know, we would get a lot of money poured into the district, but when that money left and it was tied to people, it was rough going, and like, it was just really, really hard. And we talked about holding schools harmless. And I don't know if you're really holding them harmless if you decimate the entire central office structure that's supposed to support them. Like that still is a crisis in its own way. And that makes me nervous. What about you?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of these economic indicators that people don't really understand, like how critical schools are to the city's, you know, economic base, how many people we employ. But the crisis is going to come, I think, in part, there's a crisis that we're not talking about, and that's all the kids who haven't shown up for school, right? And that is terrible for kids to begin with. And there are kids who are every single day dropping out because distance learning is not working for them. And so I want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to like what I think the future of learning looks like. But when, you know, I talked to a superintendent who told me, quiet as kept, we haven't found 6,000 of our kids, right? Every superintendent that I know is grappling with low enrollment numbers or finding kids or what have you. And since we're all funded on a per pupil funding formula, the loss of 6,000 kids in any one year is catastrophic for a school district, right? And so what will happen, and I watch teachers unions like completely ignoring the connections here, right? They want to keep their whole entire jobs. They only want to work for a couple of hours and everybody gets paid the same thing and nobody gets laid off. There is no way to sustain not just bus drivers and whatnot, staffing levels generally of instructors, educators, faculty members, administrators. Like we have to, when you look at the whole hybrid model, like we are placing our old standards of staffing on a completely new situation. And we're not going to have the luxury of that because districts and charter management organizations are not going to have that kind of money. Further, funders don't want to step in and fill in gaps, right? Funders want to do innovation. Funders want to do stuff around education or whole child stuff, and all of that is really important. But there is a critical academic base that is up for grabs right now. Who is defining it? Who is funding it? Like these are fundamental questions that are going to have to be worked out shortly. And
I think you're right.
Let me say one other thing. I think that philanthropy, there is a question around the role of philanthropy in defining that thing. How did I just put it out there?
In defining staffing, you say?
In defining what the future of the educational core looks like. I think that there are some philanthropists who have very clear ideas about what that should look like and use their money to drive some new models. I think there are other philanthropists who are trying to preserve not the status quo, because we think the status quo is terrible, and I actually think that there's so much about the status quo that we don't appreciate that we actually need to maintain. But I just think that different people, I feel like philanthropy has had an outsized role in driving the education reform agenda over the last 20 years or 30 years. And I think there are real questions about what that looks like or what that should look like moving forward.
Well, that is spicy. I think you're right. I'd also say one of the things that one of the things that really sticks with me is how, and I don't know if this was true of you in human capital, but when I was in human capital, I spent 90% of my day keeping the district afloat. It was a lot of like, just how do we keep it standing today? So I didn't have as much time to do some of the innovative work that I would have loved to spend a lot of time on. And it was interesting because I always worry that people on the outside think that like the inside stuff is just really easy, that like, and you're like, whoo, we are really keeping this, especially in Baltimore where we had such steep budget cuts and we were like, it was sort of a patchwork. And I say that because there are all these mission critical, like when I talk to my friends who are still in human capitals across the country, they are grappling with FMLA and retirement and payroll processing and do you have employees across 150 sites submit hours? Like, do the secretaries still submit the hours per teacher? Are they logging in? Like all these really functional questions, but like without an answer, there's no payroll, right? And how do you interview subs? Like, what is a substitute on Zoom? Like, what is it, like these questions that are really big. I used to run staffing in Minneapolis and we had over 100 languages spoken and we only had 70 schools, like that's sort of that is a whole different staffing thing. So I am like really interested in PNTP, as we both had a relationship with, was really a pioneer in like helping districts think innovatively about staffing. And what will that look forward, given that the bounce back here will also be really hard? Kaya, I'm interested, as we transition to the next question, I'm interested in like, how do you think about learning loss? Like I think about all the kids who, like those buckets of kids who are doing distance learning and it's working for them, the kids who are doing it and it's not working for them, and the kids who are not doing it at all. And when schools do reopen, they'll all be in the same class again. And it'll be, I think about being a math teacher, it'll be the kids who like didn't learn how to divide, but are in 7th grade, the kids who did, like, I don't know if we will have the support to do the remediation that will just be necessary given what's happened.
So I think that the opportunity here is like there is no way to go back to what we were doing and expect it to work, right? We have the opportunity to blow some things up. So maybe you think about heterogeneous grouping of kids, right? Maybe you don't think about putting kids in grades, but maybe this is the thing that catapults us to mastery learning, right? All that matters is you need these skills, and it doesn't matter what grade you're in. When you're ready, you have the opportunity to take these skills and advance. Maybe this is the opportunity for personalization to really take hold so that kids can go at their own pace. Maybe this is my like hope and dream. Maybe this is the opportunity to blow up the Carnegie unit, right? Which just does not make sense, right? Seat time is not the thing on which we should be granting educational credit. And so maybe this new situation allows us to really rethink how we measure learning and how we take kids along a learning journey in a different way. I think one of the most interesting things about this is that it's opened up content provision in a new way. It used to be that all content came from schools and from the school district and from a handful of textbook publishers and what have you. But now everybody's out creating content, right, including me, and making it available to kids offline, online, right, in new and exciting ways. Like learning is no longer just about the 8 to 3 that happens during school or in a bricks and mortar place. And so what does that mean for schooling as an institution? Like, how do you deal with the fact that parents, students, people are out here curating content on their own? And how do we make that meaningful? Because sometimes the stuff that's happening outside of school is actually more interesting, more rigorous, more relevant than what's happening in school now that you have the democratization of content provision. And so I'm really interested in how the education system reinvents itself to keep on doing what it's doing for people who want to do that. But for other people who are pulling content from places, can I pull content from a bunch of places for my kids and say, here, does this make an elementary school credential or a high school diploma. And I think I see some opportunities there to loosen up the monopoly and to create some different roles for educational institutions.
Oh, I'm interested too as an organizer in what happens with parents after this moment. So in the same way, when I hear you talk about like the curriculum opening, there are so many parents who for the first time, not for any other reason, but everybody's stuck at home, they are seeing a play-by-play of what their kids' education looks like. Like they are seeing the lesson, they're seeing the morning meeting, they're seeing they are watching the homework, and it's not like a pop-in. It is like every day. They're like, I'm in Spanish class too. I think about my sister. She calls me every time my nephew has gym. She's like, DeRay, this gym class is intense. So it's interesting. I think parents have a focus that or a lens in that they might not have even had an opportunity to have before.
And a part of me, they have a front row seat.
They got front row everything. It's like, I don't know, a lot of them would say it's not a seat. That is that they are right there. They're standing at attention. But it'll be interesting to see what that does, how that translates into advocacy on the parent side, because there will be way more parents who intimately understand. They're like, nope, I saw this curriculum, I saw that thing, or why did you explain this? This is not, it's not good enough. Show me the options. Whereas I feel like parents before have been treated like the really cool bystanders. So like, please come in when we want you to, please tell us these things that we asked you. And but now it's like, no, I really did see the whole curriculum.
I think that this is one of the most promising things about this particular moment, that the education establishment is forced to reckon with parents as partners. You literally cannot do distance learning for some kids unless parents are engaged and involved, and no longer the engaged and involved on our terms. Like, parents have some things to say because they are seeing this and because they know what's good and right for their own kids. And so I think if educational institutions are not totally rethinking what I won't even call it partnership, but I won't call it engagement, I would call it partnership, what parent partnership really looks like, then I think that you'll see parents exercising choice in very new ways. Because, we see it. We see parents opting out of systems that are unresponsive to their needs. I think that parents know, these parents are the ones who are telling you distance learning is working for my kid or distance learning is not. And we have to be responsive. They are customers, our clients, our stakeholders. We have to be responsive in different ways, I think, than we have been. Okay, I have a question for you, this man. People keep on talking about this time as a racial reckoning and how, I guess I'll ask the same question that we started with in the beginning. We are talking a lot about race. We're talking a lot about race. What implications do you think the current protests and the current conversation about race in America will have on schools in the long term?
Well, I'll just say, as you know, I spend most of my time on the police now, and the policing metrics haven't changed. So the police have actually killed more people this year than last year. COVID, quarantine, lockdown, protests had no impact right now. So I say all that to say that, when I look at the measurement, I'm like, ooh, I'm nervous that a lot of what people think is change is actually symbolic and not structural. And I don't want that to be the case with public education. I'm hopeful about what you said about can we blow up this idea of grades, right? Can we do mastery track? I'm interested in that. I think what I've seen people struggle with is how do we do that at scale, right? People are like, yeah, we can do that in this school. I can do that in this classroom. I don't know how to do that across a district of 80,000 kids. I don't know how to do that across a district of 100. So I'm interested in that as an idea. I want to figure out how we help people believe that that's scalable. I think the second thing, and from my human capital lens, I'm always can we find the talent to meet the promise? Does the talent exist? Some days I'm it does. Some days I'm I don't know, we need a lot of great teachers. Just the sheer number of talent we need. And I look on the pipeline, forget the programs, but the pipeline in general, universities, did it. And like Kaya, I don't think we're very honest about the quality of pipelines across the board. You know, like I think that there's a lot of work with like the pipeline of teachers, and I hope this moment is a reckoning for that. But the third thing is,
but what do you wait, hold up, what do you say to these people in the audience who've been funding teacher pipeline stuff over the last 20 years to radically improve the caliber of teachers in our systems?
I will say in Baltimore, Minneapolis, we were not always about the universities, and like I obviously like the universities, sign me up for the universities, but there's a big university in Baltimore that literally would not send teachers to teach in Baltimore schools. So I'd be at board meetings getting lashed about like, why don't I have black teachers from da-da-da? And I couldn't say, ruin our partnership with the university, I couldn't say that their school of education will not send teachers to us. Like they will not. They kids teaching in Baltimore City Public Schools. That was true. But like we couldn't say it for political reasons. The other thing in Minneapolis, I'll never forget, we had the Ellen office came to me, I led all staffing, and she's like, DeRay, do not hire this teacher. She's like, I mean, these teachers from this university. She's like, don't hire any because they don't come out knowing how to teach reading. And I said to her, the licensure rules in Minnesota are so strict that if I don't hire from this university, there just won't be elementary. Like it's either these people or substitutes because I can't really hire anybody else. And it's like nobody was honest about it. Like the universities have an outsized political influence on the licensure process and the pipeline in ways that philanthropists run away from, superintendents didn't want to deal with that I saw. Like people just let the universities do whatever. And it was like, I don't want to have another conversation about Teacher America if we're not having a conversation, or like TNTP or the fellows or whatever, if we're not having a conversation about the full pipeline. Like that just wasn't honest. And as the person who I'd hire 700 new teachers a year. So I need every single, TFA can't do that. TNTP, like no one partner can get me to 700. And I knew that. So I actually needed everybody at the table, and we did it every year. But Kaya, it was much harder than it had to be.
But how is this moment not an opportunity to do something very different, right? So do teachers have to come through university, or is there a way for us to rethink who can deliver instruction? Why aren't we tapping into, we have artists, right, who are unemployed right now, many of whom work well with kids, right? We have subject matter experts who could actually also, with some facilitation, deliver content to kids, right? This is literally an opportunity to bust up the whole entire thing, potentially, because there aren't, I say all the time, there's not 5,000 amazing teachers sitting out on Teacher Island waiting for us to find them. And it's going to take years to develop those people. So how do we use this moment to redeploy new leaders and new people to deliver on instruction? How do we mobilize? I mean, I think some of the most clarion voices in this moment are students. I was reading about kids in Baltimore who started protesting defund the police, and then in like 15 seconds they shifted to, wait a minute, I don't see myself in the curriculum. I want curriculum that's more culturally relevant. And so how do we step up? I actually think curriculum is a place where we could potentially see significant long-term change in education because, of everything from 1619, 1776, whichever, date to which you subscribe, or like all of these like new conversations about history. I think that we have the opportunity to, if we listen to students and if we respond to them as stakeholders as well, to really change some different things, including who is delivering and how it gets delivered.
Yeah, my push to you, Kaya, is I agree with that. And I think DC was an anomaly to a lot of people because you all took a ton of risks. That's how we knew you, is that like you all were risk takers. Do you see that same risk taking across the country? Because I would say, and I don't necessarily I see the language of the risk taking. I don't see the action of the risk taking, which is why I'm like which is why I sort of want to push.
I mean, I think that this moment is giving people the freedom to take risks that they would not otherwise take. I have read about schools and school districts. I had a conversation the other day with a charter school leader, a CMO management leader, who said, we have always divorced ourselves from issues of poverty like hunger and whatnot. She's like, and we don't have the luxury of doing that. We have to serve our families in a completely different way. I've seen superintendents deploy their whole central office to go knock on doors and find kids and engage with community in ways that they never have before. I actually think that this moment allows us some political cover to go out and do some really radical things. But I do think that philanthropy has a role to play in supporting that and encouraging that and not penalizing people for not doing whatever is in their, grant materials, the grant application that they wrote 2 years ago, right? Like, I think the question is, how do we create the safety and the space for people to take risks without worrying about, angering their funders or going in a different direction or something like that. I think the thing that we had in DC was, cover, and we actually didn't have a lot of philanthropic support. We had a lot of philanthropic support around the union contract. And then there was this moment of being in a desert where we weren't getting education philanthropic support, and we had to go out and cultivate some new partners and friends, and then we actually got that support. That enabled us to do, we only used philanthropy for catalytic, innovative things, but the way we structured it, to get to your cliff point, is, okay, we want to try this new crazy thing, right? We're going to see how it is over the course of 3 years, and in 3 years, either we can run it well or we cannot, we'll abandon it. And the way we structured the philanthropy was that philanthropy is putting up 75% in year 1, 50% in year 2, 25% in year 3. And so we owned more and more of the burden, because that if we were going to continue doing it, we needed to be able to put it into our budget, although we couldn't just put it all into our budget. Right? So I think if people think creatively, if philanthropy really partners with schools and school districts and CMOs, then we could get to some very innovative, new and exciting things potentially.
There we go. Is there anything that philanthropy did when you were a superintendent that you wish they would stop doing? Or did you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Were there any things that philanthropy did while you were superintendent that you wish they would not do anymore? And I'm interested in the sort of perverse incentives of having to spend the money before the fiscal year ends. Is there a way that we can just do that better? I'll never forget when I became the chief in human capital, I had to spend this $700,000 on this dashboard, and I inherited the plan. It made no sense, and I went to Santa Lisa's like, Sonia, I cannot in good faith spend $700,000 to redeploy static demographic information. Like, that is a waste of money. Like, that is why people hate the government. And we had to figure out a way to use the money, and it was not easy, but it was one of those things that was really hard. Yeah, so I'd love to know, again, anything philanthropy can stop doing. And then what about the funding, the sort of fiscal year funding issue we all face?
What I would say about what I think philanthropy could stop doing or do very differently is, I think a lot of times, I just could call it the wag the dog syndrome, where philanthropy would figure out what its strategy was going to be and decided what it was going to pursue. And then I watched schools and school districts chase those priorities, whereas in fact, schools and school districts need to figure out what their priorities are, and then the appropriate philanthropists who are aligned to those things need to come to the table and, again, partner. I think sometimes there is the power dynamics around the people with the money. Holding schools and school districts accountable is sometimes weird. The best philanthropic partnerships I worked on were true partnerships, where we both brought something to the table and had a little bit more even of a power dynamic. But I think that's hard for a lot of folks to reckon with. And I think if philanthropy is going to see the kind of wholesale systemic change that I think everybody wants, I think it means reevaluating the power dynamics, reevaluating who's at the table. I think it means listening to the people closest to the problem because they often have the best solutions. You know, we think that because we have the fancy spreadsheets and the ability to convene experts and the ability to write research reports that we know more than anybody else. But in fact, communities, students, families, they have data. It might not be on a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint. They have expertise, they have skills, they have experience. And when you bring those two things together, that's when the magic happens. And I think that philanthropy can catalyze, which is different from driving. And I think we've seen philanthropy try to drive an agenda or drive a set of strategies instead of working in conjunction with people to catalyze something different.
Boom.
There's that. Yeah. Wade asked the question about who should be leading our schools. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that some of our most important work is choosing school leaders and like creating a pipeline that is more robust, that is more diverse, and also making sure that there are real requirements to be a school leader. I'll never forget Minneapolis. One of the things I did for my short time period there is that I created the way that we evaluate school leaders. Like I packed it up. And I'll never forget, we put together, which is not, this will not be big for you because DC had done it all the time ago, but we put together a, like a video requirement, right? Like people had to watch the video and get feedback. And it was no role play. It was like written email to the teacher about what you saw. And Kaya, I'll never forget, we rated it on this rubric. We made the rubric in advance, right? Because that's a best practice. Everybody fails. And we're like, okay, we have no principles. It was like a real nightmare. And then we talked to the four superintendents who oversaw the schools, and it was clear that like people actually didn't know what good instruction looked like or bad instruction. Like they had just been in the district for 20 years, or they had been in the district for 10 years, like, and they had worked their way up. But it was like being a school leader should require you being like some sort of instructional something, right? That's like a low bar. And I am really interested in how do we even guarantee those things across the country while we also work on just like increasing the way that we recruit. I'm interested too in like what you offer about we should be more creative about who can teach our kids. That like we know that most of the licensure stuff, questionable, right, at best. And that even in the places where it might be robust, that like there's still more work to do. So that we're not like keeping amazingly talented people out of the district because they don't have something, but they might have a ton of something else. And, you know, districts like in Maryland, we could get creative because in Baltimore, I had the power to give anybody a teaching license, which is sort of different. But that was not the case in most cities and most states.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question, what is good instruction? This is the question that everything else hinges upon. I was reading the Grant Makers for Education report that came out recently that said that philanthropy was moving away from K-12 education and, you know, really centering on early childhood or on workforce development or on whole child things all around the kind of K-12 academic core. And I was asking myself why. And I think it is because we fundamentally don't have an answer to what is good instruction or more, I guess appropriately, how do we get there quickly? And so I think people have poured a lot of money into everything from human capital to curriculum to, you know, social and emotional learning to whatever. And it hasn't gotten the sort of broad transformation that we've been looking for our kids. And so I think that philanthropists have been backing away, but now COVID, now racial reckoning, and everybody is running back to K-12 education as the answer. And I worry about two things. On the one hand, we still don't have a clear answer to what is good instruction and how we get there. But I worry that schools are now, you know, saddled with managing all of these things because school is where kids show up. And so all of the problems show up in school. And so we're putting all of these burdens on school, which is, again, why I think coordinated efforts with the government and other supporting agencies is really important. But this question around what is good instruction and how we get there, I think we cannot back off of that. We can't. It's not okay to just say, I'll take the cute little babies or I'll with kids, transitioning to workforce when K-12 hasn't worked for them, and so they're not ready for workforce, right? And that leads me to who is teaching, who is leading, how do we think about those questions very differently?
I do also think that this is a moment, one of the things I was always frustrated with working at the district level was that I knew other districts were facing similar problems, and I didn't have a way to learn from them quickly, And I knew funders were funding us the same, but I couldn't be the only person dealing with this obscure FMLA thing, or I couldn't be the only person trying to figure out the teacher mentor problem, or and trying to think about how do we scale some of those best practices without an in-person convene. I don't have time to go to a 3-day conference in the middle of America with other human capital people. That's not the best use of my time right now. But I do want to learn from them. And I one of the things I wish that I would have gotten from some of the funders in city schools is just access to a set of tools, and not necessarily a requirement that we use them, because that was always annoying, right? You get this they're fit all of what you're doing into my 4 boxes. And you're well, your 4 boxes don't really mean anything to me. So that wasn't helpful. But I do think that I wish we could have more access to tools that other people had used so that we could figure out how to use them for ourselves, or mold them, or at least use them as a thinking pad. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. But you know how it is, right? Your head is down. You are dealing with all of the day-to-day issues, and there's rarely an opportunity to come up and convene with your compadres about how to do this differently. But again, in the same way that we are intentional about creating space for teachers to learn from each other, or for principals to do that, I think we have to recognize that the people who support them actually need that time as well. We only have a couple minutes left, but we've talked about students a little bit. We've talked about teachers, leaders, central office people, philanthropists. We haven't talked about the federal government. What do you think the role of the federal government is in education moving forward?
I'm excited about the new Secretary of Education at Biden wing, so I'll be putting your name in the hat with Kaya. So I'm excited about that. I'm starting rumors, everybody. There's no, but it's a good rumor. I'm interested in, I think that the next Secretary of Education will have a ton of cleanup, but I'm interested in what happens when there's an Office of Civil Rights again, and what happened during this 4 years of nothingness, right? Where all the complaints are cleared. I'm sure discrimination is at an all-time high, and we just don't even know where the hotbeds are. I remember in Minneapolis, we had an Office of Civil Rights finding because we were disproportionately suspending kindergartners of color. And I'm sure those things are happening. I'm interested in Zoom suspensions and discipline. What's the reckoning with all of that that's happening? And as you know, the federal government, really money is is their big driver in education. And I do think that there are interesting ways that we can fund it differently. I also hope that there's real learning from Race to the Top so that we never do that kind of thing again, because it was such a good idea. But living through the fallout of the loss of money was one of the worst. I will never forget laying off all those people. And it was not good. And people shouldn't have to, employees shouldn't have to live through that. School system leaders shouldn't have to live through that. So I'm hopeful that we can think about giving big sums of money to districts in ways that don't lead to that dire outcome in the end. What about you?
It's a big question for me, because I feel like we had a very activist Department of Education during the Obama administration, and pacifist, no show sort of
gentle.
Yeah, something during this administration. And so, but I wonder what the next secretary will have the power to do. I feel like after Arne Duncan and John King, there was really a congressional backlash to sort of rein in the Department of Education and how much it could do. And I would assume that, depends all on whoever the next president is, what this new administration will allow the education department to do, I think is going to be interesting. I do think that there is the need for at least the bully pulpit of a vision, a national vision for what education could and should be, with very clear direction for the different roles that people need to play in that.
Yeah, I'll also be interested to see, if we really have learned from the past sort of reform, I'm hoping that we don't do what we did already, which was like, we're like small schools, like that we just repeat all of those things that like didn't work everywhere or didn't work in a lot of places, that we really do use this moment as a place for innovation. And Kyle, when I think about one of the things that could be really interesting is not centralizing, but have a place where people can go to like learn through some of the innovative things, like see plans, other people's plans. Because like I'm close to principals who are this moment, they're like, I've been a principal for a long time, but being a COVID principal is like being a first year principal. She's like, I'm learning all this new. It's like, what is lunch and pickup and whatever hybrid? Like it feels really new. So I know people who don't have the time to like be heads down and like innovating around the curriculum, but want to do it and just need a little bit of help. And where's that place that they go to look at somebody else's plan for like how they redid this or how they could do this differently? And I don't know what that place is right now, but I hope that place emerges.
I think that is part of what philanthropy, that's one of the great things that philanthropy has helped a lot of us do, which is take the time and the space and create systems to learn from one another. So that may be a great place to start. This was a good conversation, and
always great to talk to you, Kaya.
Likewise, DeRay, and thank you, Grant Mckesson for Education, for having us.
Yes, so great to be here, Grant Mckesson for Education. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation that comes after this. Kaya, I don't remember the address to the Department of Education in Washington, but I will be there on the first day.
And DeRay, we're looking forward to the next conversation as well. I invite you to join me in thanking Kaya and DeRay for their rich insights and experiences. There are so many takeaways from their conversation, but a few things that I heard was to apply a systems lens through a coordinated strategy and to break out of silos. I heard that our education system is forced to reckon with parents and caregivers. And the bottom line is that it is now a great time to take risk in pre-K through 12 education. So we are well positioned to expand on Kaya and DeRay's conversation by hearing from an incredible group of education grant makers on meeting the needs of pre-K through 12 system. And for that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Layla Avila, who serves as CEO and Executive Director for Education Leaders of Color, a membership organization dedicated to elevating the leadership voices and influences of people of color in education, and to leading more inclusive efforts to improve education. Previously, she worked for more than 15 years at TNTP, a national nonprofit focused on improving educational quality for all students. She also served as an analyst for the White House Initiative on Education Excellence for Hispanic Americans. It is my pleasure to turn things over to Layla. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I appreciate your introduction there. And I would like to introduce our panelists for the next session, who will be helping us lead this conversation around the future of K-12. So we have Brooke Stafford-Brizzard, who is at CZI, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We have Jacqueline Jones, who's at the Foundation for Child Development. And we have Marc Sternberg, who is at the Walton Family Foundation. Welcome, everybody. Good to see your faces again.
You too.
Yeah. So I'd like to start with just reflecting on the commentary that you heard in this conversation between Kaya and DeRay. I certainly walked away with some, big themes from their conversation. I heard, Kaya beat the drum that actually has been one of the foundational values for EdLock around the intersectional approach in K-12 education that has always been a necessity, but I think COVID has really laid bare not being able to ignore hunger, housing when you're trying to educate kids during this pandemic. I heard them talk about the funding cliffs that are coming and how we might be able to support our school systems. And then I heard a real opportunity for innovation, right? And learning from this time to not go back to the things that we have been doing in the past, like blowing up seat time, like really seeing parents as partners, like focusing on mastery, right? Rather than sort of the hours that that students clock in. But I'm curious from you all, what stood out from that conversation?
I'm happy to kick us off. I agree with you and Kyle. It was such a rich conversation and wonderful to listen to. I did hear kind of the push and the call to kind of explore how we design for student experience, whether we call that personalization or something else. And recognizing like this time has kind of forced us to recognize that students live within a 24-hour cycle. And we've, in the past, kind of forced them to experience this system around what we've designed in terms of the systems around them. And so what if now we could take the opportunity to reorganize around the student and their experience and organize those systems around the student, and thinking about out of school time and their experiences at home. I think that requires us to see children and students as whole people, and requires us to say that's not the stuff around education. Whole child development should be education, because it's about academic development. And then what we see inside, oftentimes in out of school time, a deeper focus on identity development, meaning kind of racial ethnic identity, gender identity, ourselves as multifaceted individuals. And the other thing I think that was really important, and I really strongly agree with, is exploring what quality instruction looks like. And that, there's curriculum, and then there's also pedagogical practice. And when we think about the recommendations that have emerged from some really important groups of experts in the past several years, like the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, those recommendations have called for a deeper focus on relationships, a stronger integration, and getting out of those silos that you speak to, Layla, and not saying there's an SEL curriculum over here and an academic curriculum over here. So if we think about the how of teaching being in relationship, connecting to students, a social process, then as funders, if we think about also deeply investing in pedagogical practice, in addition to curriculum, I think we could have a profound impact.
Yep. And I think that when people are doing this well, right, they're doing exactly what you're saying. It's like the social emotional learning in service of the academics. So they're not separate, right? And sort of, we really have to get away from thinking about these things as silos, like you fund one, but not. And I think like there's an intersectionality there with the people who are doing the work, right? You actually can't abandon teacher quality when you're trying to do these things together, right? There has to be an investment in the people who you need to be able to understand the implications of social emotional learning and its impacts on academics. What about you all? What about you, Jacqueline? What stood out to you from that conversation?
I live my life in this early childhood space, and it occurred to me that there may be some lessons from early childhood where you do think a lot about relationships, and you think a lot about social emotional development as well as academic achievement. And so this is a place where I think folks in early childhood have been struggling and in some cases succeeding for a very long time to bring the two together. And I think there's always the concern in early care and education that they're going to go off to the schools and suddenly everything will change and there'll be less of a focus on the social emotional development, less of a focus on the whole child. But I think that if we look at a continuum of care for children from preschool all the way to 12 or maybe even through college, this thread of relationships and social emotional development continues. And I think we need to make sure that we learn some lessons there. I think the conversation around the importance of connecting education, health, housing, jobs, it is critical. A part of my life was in New Jersey as the assistant commissioner for early childhood, and we had a lot of money in the Abbott preschool program, and I would think this is great. We're going to have this wonderful preschool program, and we did. But parents still had no jobs. Children were still living in difficult circumstances. And so we've got to think of the totality of that. I think one of the things that struck me was this notion of perhaps more focus on place-based strategies. I think education is local. I certainly think at the federal level there's a role, but the states really do have an opportunity to think about what works in what context. We want to scale things up and make everything the same across the country, everything the same across the state. It's not possible. How do we really figure out what context brings and means and who the community is? The other thing I thought about was this notion of what makes good instruction. And I thought maybe we should also think about, because we have to answer that question, why are we doing this? What do we want our young people to be? What is the role of education in the 21st century? What are we preparing children to do? And I think we get back, we have got to have good educators. We just have to. But we have to have a clearer sense of what they should know and be able to do, how they support children, and a range of people in the community who might be participating in this. I think as funders, we often don't bring everyone to the table, and we've certainly, as our foundation, gotten much more focused on, if we're looking at the workforce, let's hear from them. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for philanthropy to start to listen to the multiple voices that have some interaction with young children as we think about education, to see what voices are we missing, what do communities want. We can't always define that in exactly the way that we think they should be defined, and they may differ, and that's okay. But how do we support the change while we still want absolute excellence for children and for teachers?
Yeah, what I'm also hearing in you is such an asset-based frame of how you talk about communities and their role in the education of children, different than at times of how we've addressed them. Marc, what stood out for you?
Well, I first of all, Layla, thanks for having me, and great to be with you guys. I'm going to be brief because I agree with so much of what has already been said. I found that to be honestly a very refreshing conversation in which I found a lot of truth, and some courageous truth, honestly, about the things that Brooke and Jackie are talking about, the things that are frankly broken, that have been broken for a long time, that despite the best efforts of wonderful administrators and teachers and parents, we have an obligation to fix. And I think what I heard from DeRay and Kaya is just sort of, especially in light of the GFE findings, which I think we're going to talk about, man, this is a moment to double down. This is a moment to focus on things like listening to each other and to communities, Jackie, to your point, and things like innovation in instruction and curriculum and pedagogy, as Brooke points out. And thinking, and I'm going to go back to something I heard from Kaya, sort of a general theme of giving ourselves permission to reinvent how school works. I mean, let's be truthful. And I think that's what DeRay and Kaya are asking us to do. Be truthful about what has been working and what hasn't been working, especially for brown and black families living in poverty across the country. And despite the best efforts of a lot of wonderful educators, there's a lot that we now have an opportunity to fix. And I think this moment shines a light on what we can fix, and puts, frankly, and I'll stop here, puts the voice of parents more prominently into the conversation, because as DeRay said, they are right there. And I will say, as am I with my three boys, one of whom is certain to walk into the room during this discussion, so you'll probably meet them.
Yep, same. You might hear mine in the background yelling as they say, "Hi, mommy."
I feel like high school principal again.
Totally. Well, so you referenced, and you heard Kaya reference that Grantmakers for Education, does this benchmarking survey, and we got a preview of some of their findings, which I want to talk to this panel about. And so in there, in some of their findings, they saw that the things that are a sense of urgency and opportunity for system change, as defined by grant makers who fund education, are one, improving remote learning, including broadband, getting access to devices, and training teachers around remote learning. Two, addressing resource inequities in school budgeting. And three, social emotional trauma-informed supports for students. The things that were at the bottom in terms of priorities for funding were school choice, academic and curricular improvements, so things like literacy and STEM instruction. And three, which is like a dagger to my heart, teacher quality, which I'm like, I don't know how you do any of these things without focusing on teacher quality, but let's talk about that. So when you saw the findings, like, what is your reaction to that? What does it make you think in terms of your own funder priorities? And what do you think is making you, where would you sort of say, like, no, actually, let's double down? And maybe want to do some advocacy to, fellow funders. Marc, I'm going to start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a survey like this that there's a lot you can grab onto. One theme that I guess I took away from my reading and earlier conversations about the findings was sort of a walking back a little bit from K-12. And if you can sit through the last hour with those two people and not be ready to run through a wall on K-12, I'm not sure what's wrong. Like, this is our moment, is what we think. And I think some of the themes elevated, like how to make remote learning real and how to rethink instruction and the modalities of instruction in this moment, and how to balance those things. And I'll let Brooke talk about this. How to balance rigor with compassion and being there for a generation of kids who 2 out of 3 are reporting to us are feeling anxious and stressed or depressed. This is as important a moment in education and education philanthropy as I can ever remember. It feels more important than any other time in my 25 years in the field. We are in a window to solve some of these hard problems. So, and that's what parents are telling us. That's what students are telling us. That's what policymakers are talking about. The questions are, are we ready to execute? So those are my high level findings. I'll stop by saying, summarily, Walton is doubling down. Like, we are going to run harder than we have ever run at these problems.
Yep. Yeah. Brooke?
I agree with so much of what Marc has said. I look at the top 3 in terms of access and equities and trauma, and I recognize that we're all in response mode. These are the things that are right in front of us right now, and they need to be responded to. So recognizing that without walking away from the innovation, the risks, and the reinvention that we're hearing the call for today, and doing that in partnership. I heard so clearly from both DeRay and Kaya, like, we have to stop thinking we have all the answers in philanthropy and listen and connect and deeply partner with community and practitioners. And, I think that when I think about, I appreciate Marc raising compassion balanced with rigor. I've heard, it breaks my heart when I hear, relationships in education defined as, I've heard it before, loving kids to death. That's not what developmental relationships are, right? The research shows it's about holding each other accountable. It's about sharing power. It's about being consistent and there, someone that a student can trust. And if we bring that into the classroom with more rigor, that is what is needed in the moment. And I think also something that can transform the education experience for many, many students.
Yeah. I agree. I think it would be wrong for us to ignore what is right in front of us, right? The fact that kids don't have access to devices or connectivity, right? The fact that families are food insecure, housing insecure, all those things are, being laid bare by COVID. Jacqueline, birth to 5 care was in the middle of the rankings, and some of the best practices of early childhood that you originally mentioned around social and emotional learning and building relationships, right, were sort of at the top. What's your reaction to those findings?
I understand the frustration with attempting to make significant change in something as big and hairy and ugly as American education. I get that. But I also think that as I look around our political environment right now, the racial issues we have got to confront, that an educated populace is critical to this democracy. So I don't think we have a choice. Just to broadly, I don't think we can run away from it. It is at the heart of how a democracy works. And it is a right, I think, for children, all children, to be able to say, I will get a high quality education. Parents should expect that. That is, I think, the job of government to do that at different levels, but to do that. So I think for early care and education, we have an interesting relationship with the federal government, because while K-12 gets around 10% of their funding from the federal government, and most of it is local, it's pretty much the reverse for early care and education, with the Child Care Development Block and Head Start and all those programs. And what I see is incoherence from the federal government that is terrifying, because it's continued with lots of attempts to really fix it. But we've got to be able to figure out what this funding looks like and how we fund places in ways that make sense, both at the federal and state level. I think we've got to be able to figure out how we let school districts use funding in a way that will support student learning, but will be flexible, because not everybody uses money in the same way. And we've got to stop pitting, I think, K-12 against early childhood and against middle school against high school. You've got Title I money, and it's lovely. It's a big pot of money, but everyone's hands in there, and so somebody will get some, which means that someone doesn't. These are bad ways, I think, to fund education. It's a continuum. Children are going to go across that continuum. It is our responsibility to make sure that we get it right, and we haven't, and we've got to acknowledge that. And we've got to listen to ways in which we can. The thing that struck me about the report was, I think you mentioned it, the teacher quality piece. The Foundation for Child Development has, over the past years, devoted all of its time to the preparation and support and compensation for the early childhood workforce. And it's just hard for me to see how we can build a solid educational continuum without, as DeRay said, a pipeline of really qualified teachers. And that doesn't mean that the teacher is the only person providing information to children, but we need teachers who can communicate with families, partner with families, see them as part of their peer group, if you will, partner with other teachers, understand child development. I think that it's lovely to be able to say, I can manage a classroom, but you have to be able to understand how children across this continuum develop, and that takes some work and some effort, some preparation. So I still see teacher quality and really supporting teachers as critical to a sound education system.
Totally agree. And then the leaders, right? The instructional leaders that we need to support the teachers that we put in the classroom. Those are not separate. So you all started talking a little bit about some of your priorities. And I'm going to jump to this question around, what we've learned. So I've heard a lot of people talk about, COVID is sort of presents this opportunity, and I'm actually a little bit like, ugh, about that language, because so many, communities have lost so many people, over 200,000 people, and disproportionately affecting, Black and brown communities. So I hate talking about COVID as an opportunity. But I will say that my hope is that, we've seen other sort of catastrophes, right, that have ravaged this country, like Katrina in Louisiana, right? Hurricanes also in Houston, Texas. So we've seen these catastrophes. And sort of my question to you all is, and philanthropy responded in a certain way, and the education reform responded in a certain way, and the government responded in a way. So my question to you all is, what have we learned that should be informing our thinking for the future? Where have we succeeded in the past, and where did we fail? And specifically, I'm curious about what your foundation, sort of in your peer group, has learned that is informing your strategy and your approach this time around, that is different perhaps than what we've seen at other times.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to share a little bit here, and I'll say, Walton is doubling down, but I hope also taking time to reflect on things that have gone well and things that haven't, things we have done well, mistakes we have made, and I'm happy to share some of the latter. I think that moving forward, and I think everyone has talked about this, moving forward, change is going to look the way it needs to look for a place, and it's got to be informed by local voices and led by local voices. It's got to be of a community and by a community. And that doesn't mean that, CZI or Walton or whoever walks into town or without ideas about what can be transformative. Right. I think we all want to be honest about what we believe in and the values we bring to the work and the data that we see about what can be transformative. But frame it in the positive. For any kind of change that involves probably anything, but certainly schools, to be lasting and to be transformative in the way that the four of us and everyone here believes in, it's durable and deep and sustainable way past the time we are there. It's got to be owned locally and designed locally. So that's I hope that what you will see is Walton taking the time to listen and to learn. Frankly, I mean, we collectively, all of us, have done a lot over the last 25 years, from Race to the Top to Newark to New Orleans to all of the things we're talking about here. There's a lot of data. DeRay talked about an appetite to learn, and that was a through line in that conversation. It's sort of, how do we learn from each other when we're so atomized? So frankly, community driven and taking the time to learn without compromising on values and without compromising on an energy, to run through that wall and to kind of be a resource for change.
Yep. Excellent. Jacqueline?
So we fund research, and I often think there's nothing worse than researchers who want to come in and do their study and leave, and 2 years from then they'll write their paper and nobody knows what it means. So but we try not to fund that kind of research. We try very hard to fund policy relevant research. And one of the things we've tried to do, when COVID happened, we just stopped everything and reached out to every single grantee to say, what do you need? How can we help you? And so all this notion of, when things are due and whether or not you're going to get a no-cost extension, it's just tell us what you need, tell us how we can support you. And so that took some time. And frankly, for those researchers who were working in schools, they didn't know, and some of them still don't know. But we formed in New York City what we call a research practice partnership, where we're connecting researchers to policy people, and the policymakers are saying what their questions are. And the researchers then have to use their expertise to see if these are researchable, answerable questions, instead of just the reverse, where the researchers come in with questions. And I think about, and we think it's been very successful, but if I think about what we could do better, we've not had parent voice. We've not had a sense of what do parents think, and it's all around the UPK initiative in the city. And that, I think, is something that as we go forward, we have to think more about. What does parent voice mean in that kind of context of researchers and policy people? But that's one thing. As we think about learning, it's been really important for us to figure out how we're not in this alone. One, because we're very small and we don't have enough money to pay for all the things we'd like to do. And so we've formed a collaboration of about 8 foundations, all focused on the early childhood workforce. And while, yes, you get a bigger pot of money, what's been really important is you get thought. You get folks who come in with a pretty general sense of what they want to do, but different foundations. You know, I mean, 8 different foundations is really 8 different foundations. And we brought people in to come and talk with us and help us to learn. And I think that's been incredibly helpful for us to be able to say, this didn't work or this did, but being honest about it, not trying to figure out what's the line I'm going to give to the board, but what really did not work and what do we learn from that, I think has been quite critical and important for us. And we've decided this year that we're spending a lot more money looking at advocacy for teachers. I mean, we have this focus on the workforce, but we don't really have enough voice of the people who are in those classrooms doing that work. We think we know what they want. Well, maybe we should have them tell us what they really need. And so we're spending a lot more effort and money doing that.
Yep. I love that, centering both on parents and then teachers as well. Brooke?
I not only have 3 boys who might walk in at any minute, there's a garbage truck who is, so you're going to have to forgive the background noise. I'm going to go for it. I love this conversation and where DeRay and Kaya pushed us in terms of who's at the table, and thinking about how we put together these types of partnerships and centering the researchers, policymakers, practitioners, families, community, but also addressing that power balance, Jacqueline, that you speak to. So when we think about research practice partnerships, it's not the researcher coming in to tell the practitioner and the educators how it should work, but how do they work together to innovate? So that resonates so deeply. I think that where we're seeing the need for priority is when we look at how stark the inequities in our system are. And that is what COVID and this entire year has shown us. We're not only seeing our most vulnerable students losing learning, we're seeing our most privileged students actually doing better. And so recognizing that equity has to be woven into everything that we are doing. As I agree, Marc, we all have to double down. And then recognizing that equity is not assimilation. It's not asking an individual to succeed within a system that was designed with white dominant culture in mind. But it's about redesigning the system to ensure that the student can come into this classroom as their whole self and their full identity is recognized and celebrated and connected with. And so that's an area, and we think about it through high quality instruction, through relationships, through mentoring, through how we partner with families, really centering that focus on equity and the system around the individual, not trying to take a lens of fixing anyone. We have to fix the system, not the individual.
Yep. So interesting that you bring this up, because I was on a call with one of the campaigns, and I asked what I thought was a pretty softball question, which is, with the controversy that was coming from, at that time, the president, right, who talked about, the 1619 project and his own 1776 project. Sort of my question was, do you see a role for the federal government to play in, changing what we're putting in front of kids, so that kids can actually have an opportunity to not only get a true picture of history, but see themselves in the curriculum and see themselves really sort of honored and revered in terms of their cultural backgrounds, right? And this was a campaign that, you know, I think probably thinks itself as pretty wokety woke, right? And but the response was a hard no. Like, they are not interested in doing anything related to telling people about curriculum, you know, and all that. And I think what stood out in it is like how badly burned people felt around Common Core, right? Which is, you know, I feel like we have to get over, because at the end of the day, like, it was a good thing that we did. But okay, but it made me think, like, education improvement continues and will continue to be very political and controversial, right? Even when you think you're asking a softball question, but it'll continue to be that way. But in your mind, like, what about educational improvement, educational reform is worth the controversy? Like, what about it, like, you're going to be unapologetic about pushing forward? And that might be our last question before we sort of like wrap up. So I'm curious to you here. I guess naively, like, I was surprised by that, but I shouldn't be. What do you all think?
I just want to say you did not ask a softball question, because there is a lot of tension around the federal government and curriculum. You probably made everybody shake in the room for folks to think about the federal government creating curriculum. So that was not softball. We are going to go strong on teachers and how to support them, teachers and leaders, and I think that's a good thing. But I think as we look at the whole system, if there's something that really is at the root of what I think is extraordinary inequity, it's how we fund public schools. If we continue to fund them on property taxes, we're going to be where we are all the time. And so the difference, I live in New Jersey, and the difference between property taxes in Camden and property taxes in Princeton, just worlds apart. So we've got to figure out, do we believe that every child deserves a high quality education? And that is the role of, and I think that's true. And then how do we figure out how we pay for it? Because I think this funding mechanism that keeps teachers from being paid in a way that's reasonable, that keeps school districts really still struggling, is a big issue that I just would like to see addressed. That's one of mine, so I'll let everybody else go. Then I'll come back with others.
Yep.
Well, Layla, if I was to give that group some grace, like if they interpreted the question of should we write the curriculum, I wholeheartedly agree. No, they shouldn't. It's kind of who holds the pen, right? I absolutely, and so I think what we teach is worth the controversy. We have to address our history as a country and what we're founded on, and who holds that pen. It comes right back to partnership with community and getting much more proximate. And so I think that's absolutely worth the controversy. In addition to kind of the purpose of education and the fact that we know that much more than the high school diploma is needed to succeed in this world. And so how can we kind of use this moment to redefine that? And that means individual skills, and then also the context and the conditions that we place around individuals. So we move away from this individualistic lens. So I think, what we teach and kind of what we're marching toward is absolutely what is worth the controversy.
Yeah, I mean, I think these 2 points are inarguable. Jackie, funding. I hope that we will have the courage to take that on in this moment. And we Walton, all of us, those are the hardest fights imaginable. And we've known that's where structural racism lives. We've known that. We just have not had the courage to take it on. And I agree with Brooke on what we teach matters. I actually think it's fabulous that we are having a conversation about 1619 and 1776. I think that is good for the country. And I think that whoever you were talking to is probably wise, as Brooke points out, to find the right way to enter that conversation, which I believe should be, for our next administration, investing radically in a set of resources that the next generation of American school children need. And that includes curriculum. Here's my third point to add to your two, and I think they're all connected. How about measurement? How about accountability? Like, how about, this is my 14-year-old walking in as I come. Yes, I am, please. Sorry. I promise you. Measurement and accountability. Measurement and accountability. Not as we have done it before, but as it should be done moving forward. And I'm not arguing for throw it all out, but that's what's happening right now. End of year testing, college readiness testing. Like, we are looking at a near future in which states walk fully away from instruments that tell us what students know and how they have grown. We're not going to have that. We're going to be operating in the dark. I'm being slightly hyperbolic, but only slightly. We know who will suffer the most if that happens. All of our work, the 3 of us, 4 of us, and everybody. That's worth the fight.
And measurement and accountability, I think, also has implications for school funding, right? And we've seen this in California, where California moved to a more equitable, funding system, but people, and I would say like even local advocates, have real questions about where that money is going and what it's gotten, right? In terms of student progress, student growth. So all those things are definitely connected. And I would agree that we need to know whether these things work, right? We need to know whether they work. If anything, just to be able to innovate and replicate in other places. So absolutely.
I just want to, do I have a minute to
go for
add
it.
something?
Yes, you do have exactly a minute. Go for it.
Okay, so the measurement and accountability piece, I think, is critical, because one of the things we've been looking at is how we evaluate programs. And we just have a new publication out, Getting It Right, plug for us. But it speaks to the need for context in some of these evaluations that is absolutely missing. And so we can use the most rigorous, elegant, randomized control trial that tells us thumbs up, thumbs down, a program worked or not. We don't know why. We don't know for whom. We don't know under what conditions. The question of the social sciences is always what works for whom under what conditions. And we don't ask for whom under what conditions. We just want a quick, does it work? So we need to really dig deep into this issue of what are we talking about with the measures we have, and how do we work hard to build better ones. So that was my minute.
Definitely. Good job. Well, thank you for closing us out. So we are at time, and I just want to thank this panel for having such a good, wonderful, and engaging conversation, and DeRay and Kaya for kicking us off. It gave us a ton to start with, sort of as a foundation. I think that what is clear to me is that these funders, and we hope other peers, are really paying attention to this moment of time, right, where we are in the middle of both the health pandemic, right? We're talking about the economy, and we're talking about the racial reckoning that this country is. And I hope to see more funders sort of be responsive to the moment and continue to support Black and Brown children, in our nation's public schools. So with that, I believe that I'm supposed to have like a closing slide somewhere, but thank you all for being on this panel. There it is. And so I just want to preview for all that at 2 p.m. we'll have the Brain Date Networking Hour, so don't miss out. And then at 3:30 Eastern Time, the workshop on the imperfect storm, school finance, racial inequity, and COVID-19. We were just talking about that. So it would be a great opportunity for you to continue the conversation around school finance and getting more equitable funding systems, particularly in the context around COVID-19. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate everyone who joined us today, and continue to join us for other GFE seminars and workshops. Enjoy the rest of your day.